My guest today brings a really impressive broad experience in the areas of content, digital marketing, social media, products, communications. And I had the pleasure of working with him at DC Power Co., which was a retailer for solar customers, if you don't know, about 4 years ago. Unfortunately, we only got to work together for about 6 months or so. I wish it could have been longer. But before that, my guest accumulated a lot of experience across the Australian landscape. He worked for a really wide range of companies, including Lonely Planet, AGL, Australia Post, Deloitte, Maxion, which came out of SunPower. And most recently, he started working as a marketing director with BOOMPower. And I know those guys, all really great guys, Alex and his team. I just know him as a really nice guy from Brunswick who's always up for a chat. Welcome to Charging Sessions, Matty Soccio.
Thank you very much for having me, Ewan.
How are you doing today? It's a beautiful day in Melbourne today.
Typical day in Melbourne, I think. A little bit of rain, but it's good actually. I mean, I this morning was just reading that Tasmania has had one of its driest starts to winter on record, and so to wake up this morning and see that it's a little bit damp, it fills me with a little less doom and gloom when you hear things like that, particularly when they're talking about particular types of trees in Tasmania or great swathes of forest are having dieback because of potential lack of water. So, climate change is real and we're seeing it every day. And I try to, like everyone, we try to remain optimistic and positive, but it's always a bit disconcerting when you see little reports like that come up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's hope that some of this rain has hit across the Bass Strait as well today.
Yes.
Could you tell us maybe a little bit more? I gave a very, very brief background to your vast experience in Australia. Could you give us maybe a bit of a tidbit of what's been some of your highlights in your career to date?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, obviously DC is a very specific and shining highlight in my career experience. But yeah, look, it's a funny one. Like many of us who've ended up in the energy industry, unless we've started from the start, like if you're an engineer and an electronic engineer or you're a mining engineer or something like that, a lot of us end up falling into energy. Because, I mean, if you think about it, about 10 years ago, not much had changed really in the energy industry. There was a bit of solar around. There were a few sort of rebates if people had gone in early, but for the bulk of it, the production of energy through fossil fuel, the distribution, and then the retail had pretty much unchanged. In fact, even before that, it was really just production and distribution, and that was it for about 100 years. And so, like many of us, I actually started in a different industry altogether. I started in publishing, working for a period with Kerry Packer's old ACP in niche magazines, which was fun. My first publication was Caravan World magazine. There you go. It's amazing the knowledge you learn from working in niche publishing to help set you up in the direction that you end up taking. But as you mentioned before, that kind of led me through further into publishing, and ultimately at Lonely Planet, which, a wonderful brand, has a strong heritage and really elicits really strong emotions when it comes to something as attractive as leisurely travel. And Australians, particularly Australians, are very well known for their interest and long holidays overseas. So, being a part of that team for a couple of years was really just a really fun, interesting thing to do. But more importantly, it was the sort of bridging point for me from moving from traditional publishing into marketing, into communications and content, and really getting an understanding of what content means, and the power of content, the power that it has to move people. And as we now know, over 10 years later, content is exceptionally important when it comes to energy transition. So when I actually left I left Lonely Planet to travel, because that's what people often who go and work there do. They get drawn into all the books and in the content and get inspired to do it yourself. And when I arrived back, a friend of mine had recommended a social media role at AGL Energy. And of course, like many coming into energy, didn't really know much about it. very interesting to understand how it worked. And in the first couple of months, it was a little bit of a baptism of fire. Really, what I experienced was a lot of really angry people, a lot of angry customers.
Mm.
I shouldn't say angry people. I don't mean people in AGL. I mean the customers that they had, and
Yeah.
really, it was a symptom of what was a wider problem at the time of escalating energy bills,
Mm.
and and that lack of communication, or should I say dialogue, between commercial gentailers and their customers.
Yeah.
And for the customer, one energy cover was the same as the other. There weren't that many choices, and trying to switch between them was, expensive and really, really complex. So people would be just very angry, but really couldn't do much about it.
Yeah.
Enter social media. Suddenly people have a platform for dialogue, or at least to be able to talk to each other in a public sphere.
Mm.
And suddenly, your AGLs, your Origins, your big gentailers had to take that seriously and start thinking about, well, how do we communicate to our customers so that they understand why things are the way they are, why their bill is so expensive, why their usage is so important,
Mm.
why the type of house they have will dictate the type of energy bill they end up with. So that for me was such an exciting point to enter into the energy industry, because it really was the start of energy retailers actually wanting to create dialogue
Yeah.
with their customers.
And correct me if I'm wrong, was this around the time that Andy VC was the CEO, and you're also quite active in the sort of new energy space with AGL?
Actually, this was before. This was
Okay.
actually about 2 years before. And really, the focus was very much on customer service and less about the broader change that was needed to commit to align with Australia's commitment to changing the way in which we operate to alleviate the stress on our climate.
Yep.
And it's good. It's actually good that you raised that, actually, because my early time there was still the legacy of like an older way of how energy companies operate. The CEO at the time, Michael Fraser, was well loved within the organization. He'd started there as a gas fitter in the 1970s, and he'd worked his way up to the CEO. And so coming into that, it was a very much a feeling of, this is how the way things are. Now, coming in as a resource in a space that was very new. So, coming in as someone who's doing social media, there was a lot of curiosity, maybe a little bit of kind of dismissal as well. But in the end, people understood it at least from a customer perspective. So enter Andy VC, who basically arrived like a freight train. I don't know if you remember that,
Yes.
but basically it's been about nearly 7 years, 6.5 years since Andy VC kind of kicked off the whole, the commitment to get out of coal. When you look at if you go back and you have a look at some of the reaction that it elicited from the then government of the day, it's amazing to think that it was so controversial, really, first of all, that a CEO would actually step out and make a commitment like that. That seemed counterintuitive to the way things have always been. So it really, when those things were happening there, it did feel like it was a big thing. It felt like things were shifting. And I'll never forget, probably one of the proudest achievements I have. So you asked me before, some of my career highlights. One of my distinct career highlights was, at the time, Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister, as you probably remember. And after this announcement related to AGL's commitment to transitioning away from coal, he'd made some sort of public statement that AGL had made a mistake and that we weren't going to do that. We were doing something else. And so I actually got to sit with Andy and to actually write out a tweet, because that was the quickest way. That was the quickest and at the time, a really good way to be able to get out to people really quickly how you wanted to respond to something like that from a media perspective. And so we drafted out this tweet and posted it directly to the then Prime Minister saying, no, we have made a commitment to get out of coal in blah, blah, blah. And I say that as being one of my career highlights in the sense that firstly, it showed that there was a strategic and, from a very senior level to the future, to understanding what the future looked like, and that there was a commitment to it too. Secondly, and I remember this very clearly because I remember Andy saying this to a lot of us at the time, you can't wait for governments of the day to make the decisions of when you can start making those sorts of commitments. In the end, business within the confines of policy that exists can still be the ones that actually move things forward. And then finally, anytime you could have a tweet that kind of has a go at a conservative politician and ends up on the news as well. Actually, my little tweet was like posted across Lateline and all sorts of the news channels at the time. Maybe personally, there was a little bit of gratification in that. But for me, that was very much the turning point. This is a serious thing. Energy transition is something that has to happen. It's not just a commercial decision. It's a much broader societal and, it's something that has to happen. And so really since then, I've been committed to trying to find ways to do that. Now, obviously the pandemic made things a little bit difficult. And as you said before, I had little stints at Australia Post, at Deloitte Digital, but really my heart has been in the transition, and that's why I continue on doing that today.
Awesome. No, it's I must say I've directed a few tweets to Tony Abbott in my day too, although probably not with as much impact or engagement.
In fact, if I remember correctly, you may have had directed a few at AGL as well.
Absolutely, yeah, I would have. I'm sure any fossil fuel company, any heavily invested energy company in fossil fuels can expect to get some sort of communication from me.
I should tell you this now because it's quite funny. At the time, our chief economist, Tim Nelson, one of my mentors when I was at the organization, a fantastic man, really, he was the driver behind it's time to get out of coal from an economics perspective. He mentioned you when we were talking about social media, and he remembered you specifically in terms of what you would tweet. So
I might have directed one or two against him. I know these days, you're absolutely right. He's a lot more on the right side of the transition. And I believe it's also involved perhaps with the Clean Energy Council as on the board or something like that too. So it's good to see how, some of these strong voices have either through economic evidence or other market forces kind of seeing that this is the way to move forward, and I think it's for me it's good to try to keep people and companies to account and perhaps challenge their points of views from time to time.
Absolutely,
and good to hear that it had some impact, and well, at least some it elicit some sort of emotion with Tim and others. I think you're on mute.
I think the important thing too is to acknowledge that from that point, you really did start to see not just a commercial shift towards energy transition, but the policy shift. People were, particularly consumers, were saying, okay, well, if this is where we're going, how do we make this? How do we get part of this? What can we get out of this that will help us, get cheaper bills, but also contribute to this? Now, as you'll remember from our experience at DC, it's not one or the other. People are generally supportive of anything that's good for the environment.
Yeah.
But there has to be a balance into hip pocket for a consumer as well, and that's the perennial challenge that we have as commercial entities or governments, is finding ways to ensure that people understand that by making an initial investment, that their longer term well-being is really what's going to benefit from that. And that's a big part of why communication is so important in the energy transition, because we have a tendency in the we have a tendency in the energy industry to think of things as really important. They are, but we think of them with the knowledge that we have. And we're pretty lucky because we've spent a lot of time reading, we spent a lot of time engaging. We've been immersed at all of the detail that is getting towards this energy transition. But the bulk of the general public don't have that time. They don't have that luxury. And for the most part, they get information from different sources, and the way in which people communicate them may not actually work for them. So ultimately, the success of energy transition not just rides on the movement of large organizations, but the movement of the general public and the mood of the general public, because that's what will ultimately also dictate how government just make their decisions too. I think we've done such an amazing job, and really in some areas, like you look at solar. I mean, you compare on a global scale the amount of solar that has been, and I say rooftop solar, not just grid scale. The amount of rooftop solar that has been installed onto Australian consumers' roofs is just unbelievable. I mean, and people might not actually realize how much it actually is, how much of the grid it's now taking up. And it's a wonderful thing, but it's not the only thing. There are other things, and so it goes on. We've got to talk, when you're talking about allowing people the opportunity to have energy independence. That's one thing, but then it's about, well, the bills are still coming in. Why are the bills still expensive if I've got solar? So that education and that access to to credible information is going to be an ongoing thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's tricky to, a lot of those things that we, as you say, it's an incredible success story, Australia, rooftop solar, number 2, Germany. I don't know, they probably have half as much solar per capita from memory. And then the third, is way, way down. So we're an absolute leader in the world. But with that, obviously, comes some challenges. I think one being that we do operate in an energy system where the value of electricity is obviously all a simple supply and demand calculation, and with more supply in the middle of the day with all of this solar on rooftops, that means that the value is going down. And I think it's a particularly tricky one, I think, to communicate to consumers, because you buy energy from the grid at a particular price, and it might be 25, 30, 40 cents per kilowatt hour when you need it. But then you only get paid a few cents for the electricity that you supply. And I think some of those things are very, very tricky, I think, to communicate well, to price for in the way we price electricity in Australia. And I think just to go back on the DC Power Co conversation just for a moment, but at the time we had this, new way of starting a company. We brought on about 12,000 investors that came on board. Most of them used small investments. I think the average was about $200 per person. And we had this idea of, let's get as many investors as possible. Let's get them, be a part of the company. Then, of course, they will want to become customers. We had a really competitive offering when we first went to market. I think we were in the sort of top 3 offers in Victoria, which was the most populous state. And then we realized that we were only able to convert, 10, 15% of those into actual customers, which was, I think, to me, quite surprising. But then also we had the issue around, what our actual load profile looked like for those customers, which affected our wholesale decision. I think in hindsight, it's really easy to now go, well, of course, that was going to happen in one way or other, that, with having all of these solar profiles stacked on top of each other, it's just going to have a diminishing effect on the value. But what's your reflections on that whole journey?
And look, I think you're absolutely right. I think where the genesis of where DC came from was the right idea. It was in getting people to engage with it, because these are, because the members of DC Power Co, getting those investors involved meant that people were talking about it, and meant they were getting information that was credible, and it was helping them to understand the importance behind it. And look, you're right. I mean, when you start to look at the commercial reality behind an organization that's there to service an investor base of that size, with the expectation that they would become customers, there can, like you said, there can be a difference between the expectation of the investor versus the expectation of a customer, and they're not always mutually exclusive. So there, I guess, also with a small business like DC PowerCo, like a lot of startups, unless there's a particular aspect of what you offer that takes off, very hard to keep going and going and going. So in the end, I think what DC was superbly, what we should be proud of with DC is the fact that we got so many people engaged with, energy products that were, geared towards an energy transition that people could understand. And, you know, like even partnering with companies like Redback, it's quite an early stage to be talking to consumers about the why batteries are so important, why there's so much benefit to them, and which was great. You had amazing people, like Patrick at Redback, who's now currently at Enphase, who were just really on board with the idea of making sure consumers could see why there's a huge amount of benefit to this, and this is why things like virtual power plants, electrification, a whole bunch of things that are coming or that are, part of significant invested programs now, very slowly starting to kick off, but they're starting to actually get some headway. And it's super exciting in that sense. I mean, you and I, we're in it, we're in the middle of it, but we always need to take that back step and always talk to someone who doesn't understand it and see what they think, see what their understanding of it is, and where potentially they get their information if it is something that maybe not necessarily on the right track. And that's the important lesson for anyone in energy transition, whether it's a startup or right up to a major gentailer, is that the minute you stop listening to consumers, the minute you start deviating from what will be successful for the general public.
Yeah, got you. And interesting. I just got a little follow-up question here on that. So I always find it really interesting, the impact and the scale of influence that the gas industry lobby has on Australian politics and on Australian public and around communications. And I think I'm keen actually to be exploring this probably over the next few months on how I can sort of uncover some of that information and really get a clear message out there, hopefully in some different article series. How do you think we can best take on, I guess, some of these industry lobbies that obviously have a lot of money, influence in politics, money to get publications out, to get the message out? Just to pick one example, we've got renewable gas being something that they love to talk about on whether it's on MasterChef or being advertised more generally in some of those channels. How do we go up against that and really make it clear that that's a spin on trying to get a lot of the gas assets and infrastructure continue to be paid for by Australian consumers? How do we go up against the lobbies?
It's a good question. I mean, and this is where we need to place a lot of faith in organizations like the Clean Energy Council. Sorry, it just went out of my head as I went to say. And we need to ensure that there is a balance, or at least an argument that is able to be made when that kind of marketing promotion is like that example that you just gave about MasterChef and the gas lobby. I did say that as well, and I did have to laugh because it does very much feel like the last gasp of a dying industry to be trying to get to consumers in that way. And the fact is that for a long time, up until relatively recently, and particularly in Victoria, the government made it very, very attractive for consumers to install gas. So as you can start to see, governments are now have pushed on beyond that, and without the support of government, those sorts of lobbies need to find a different way to be able to do it. Now, obviously, they've already got assets that are generating revenue for them. They're looking to protect that future revenue. And obviously there are people within the government that are wanting to see that continue as well. I mean, even as recent as a couple of days ago, the Albanese government talking about continuing to support gas exploration and its distribution. But I think the counter to that, as I said, is when you have one lobby here, you have another lobby on the other side as well, and then you start to get talking heads that have credibility. And you think about, like, say, for instance, Ziggy Forrester and the work that he's been talking about, and ironically, there's a lot about green hydrogen and a lot of that conversation, but really, he almost becomes a champion greater than many against gas and in traditional gas assets because of his understanding of how the network could work, and just how damaging that kind of exploration and distribution actually is to the environment, which seems so ironic, really. I don't know if you if you feel the same thing when I see him talking, given what his assets have been for such a long time and what's actually generated his wealth. But ironically, he ends up using that capital to be actually starting to push the industry in another direction. That's just one example. But even another great example is the EV Council, really being a voice in the, I guess you could use the word hypocrisy, but certainly the industry body for vehicles in Australia, really trying to squeeze out, or at least make it more difficult for EVs to have an equal voice at the table when it comes to Australian transport, and to actually really call them out, and to see the result of that, to see Tesla pull out of the industry body, to see action occurring because you have industry groups and organizations that are there to call out the blatant hypocrisies and often just the blatant misrepresentation of information, to be able to support the few, or to support dying industries. So, when you ask, what can we do? Well, the best we can do is to ensure that there are industry groups and organizations with credible information and data, supporting them and making sure that that information gets through to the general public. Because the problem is if you have a one playing field game, then the public only get one view of that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? And I think it's when you look at Fortescue and Agroforest as an example, it's you have that sort of double-edged sword, or even confusion that occurs when you have green hydrogen in a industrial setting or a mining setting is perhaps a completely different thing to consider from a residential point of view. We're talking about using gas in your home, and so I think it gets tricky for consumers to get, like, is green hydrogen good or bad?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at that. That's a perfect example. I mean, if you were to talk to a general consumer now about hydrogen, I'd say 9 times out of 10 you'd get silence, particularly when it comes to things like cars. The general public will go with what is best available and what is cost effective and makes them feel good, and particularly when it comes to cars. I mean, we're talking over 100 years of the automobile changing in a lot of different ways, yet combustion engine hasn't changed really that much in the past 100 years. In fact, there's plenty of other designs that kind of hit the drawing board that actually utilized variations of hydrogen to be able to fuel cars that were basically killed off by the Henry Fords at the time. But you only have to look to how quickly the EV and electric vehicle industry has ramped up just in the last 6 months since the introduction of a new government, and the presence of companies like Tesla, Polestar, and BYD. It's that kind of push that just opens the floodgate. And when you start to communicate these things in simple terms, if you have an 8 kilowatt system on a relatively medium-sized household that has a battery and an EV charger, and you have an electric car, you've basically counted off your fuel requirements, so traditional petroleum, your traditional fossil fuel energy provider, your traditional automobile that requires the combustion engine. You start taking away things
Mm.
that have a huge impact, not only on climate, but on your day-to-day life in terms of what you're paying. And that's what's going to really kind of resonate with people when they start. I mean, energy independence on its own is great, but when you can you can actually include in that real, attractive economics,
Mm.
then people start to pay attention. And really what we need, or what the general public needs, is the confidence in what they're investing in. And that's where it gets really tricky, because there are a lot of products, there's lots of batteries, there's lots of EVs that will be coming here if they're not already here. They see things like, and this is where obviously media plays a role, and I'll talk about something about that in a little while. But they see Channel 7 News talking about an LG Chem battery exploding, and people are like, well, I'm not going to invest in that. But when you compare it to any other type of product on the market, that kind of failure rate is so minuscule that people, but it's new technology, they don't know enough about it, it's on the commercial network. So this is where consistent product information, credible, people talking about why it's important, and then in the end, understanding that initial investment has a real long-term positive effect.
Yeah, and I think too, it's the example you take there with the household. If you have a car, if you have a battery, if you have solar, you do essentially remove or significantly reduce many of those ongoing costs of running your car, running your home. And I think, as an economy, we're going through exactly the same thing. We're trying to grasp, how do we go away from this economy, which has been dependent on shuffling coal and pumping gas into large centralized power stations, to now it's going to be a solar farm that requires a very little ongoing input. It's going to be some O&M costs, and there's going to be replacement costs. Same with wind. But there is a similar sort of challenge where we, as an economy overall, we're going from just keeping up, digging up things in order to keep it running, as opposed to building it and then have a much lower ongoing cost. And I think there's a fundamental shift that kind of needs to happen there for people to grasp the opportunity for us as a country, as an economy, to really go hard on that journey. I've just got a final question. I'm mindful I've taken quite a lot of your time, but from your perspective, what do you think is the most exciting thing kind of happening in whether it's the energy or e-mobility space in Australia at the moment?
I think for me, the most exciting thing is seeing how people are starting to connect those dots, where technology, economics, and social change combining to see that energy transition start. I was at a conference, Power and Utilities, this week. I think you may have been there for a day as well. And a session that I attended, which was actually emceed by John Fain, of all people, was called Building a New House on Old Foundations, which I think is such a great way to describe where we're at in energy transition right now. One of the points that John made was that how do you talk to a general public that's been hearing about energy transition for the past 10 or so years, yet their bills are still going up? They're not necessarily seeing the benefit of it straight away. I've got solar, but I'm still getting a high bill. How do you communicate to people like that? And I guess the challenge that we have for ourselves is that after 100 years of a system that is developed around a very specific way in which energy is produced, distributed, and used, in a very short amount of time, comparatively, we're trying to change the whole system. And at its base, when you look at it, generation, distribution, consumption seems like a very simple concept to change. But as you well know, you start to look into how that actually occurs in the current system across Australia, and you realize that once you start building a new house on top of that, suddenly becomes slightly more complex. But something that, so Heidi Lee was on this particular panel. I think Heidi as well. Amazing brain and amazing speaker on energy transition. And one of the things that she talked about, and this is what I think is the most exciting, is that when we talk about energy transition, when the media talks about it, when business talks about it, when government talks about it, it's all very it's top down scale, big scale stuff, closing coal, opening wind farms and solar, all that kind of big policy, big project stuff. But ultimately, where we're having the greatest impact is deployable technology at the consumer level that is being driven from the top upward. So that example that I gave you around people getting the opportunity to understand the benefit of a lifestyle and an existence
Mm,
where they generate their own energy, it's utilized to do more in their household. It allows them to electrify, which in itself means that they start to then reduce their reliance on another fossil fuel that they don't need. And then they start to see the benefit from that. And right now we're starting to see the impact. It's not just solar PV anymore. It is, heat pumps coming into Australia, where before they were not really a very popular thing. They're not really something that we necessarily would seek out. But now we're starting to see product diversification in that space.
mm,
We're starting to see more people wanting to invest in EVs and mobility. This is why it's exciting, is right now we're starting to see the needle turn at that level.
mm,
But it will only be successful once it becomes accessible to not just people who are able to pay for it, but
mm.
people who are gonna need it the most. And
Yeah.
this is where government has the greatest role, is they need to be using taxpayer dollars to support people to make that transition, so
Mm,
that they're not falling behind, and then we're not lagging in it. And then that way, to go back to John Fane's, his assertion that, after 10 years, the general public are sick of hearing of it because they can't see impact. Well, there hasn't been enough impact because we haven't seen it occur at a scale that would actually see a result. So for me, we're starting to see the needle turn. We need to remain optimistic that we're going to, as that needle turns and as adoption of this technology becomes a part of everyday life,
mm, mm.
then we can start, pouring champagne, hitting the party poppers, and then moving on to the next type of technology that will just improve our society even more. Because for me, it's not just about climate; it's about how we have the impact on climate.
Mm.
So we need to move society to be able to understand that and to move itself. So.
Yeah, and I think maybe as a final point too, I think it's very important that we also create, enable, and make visible some of those platforms that help make the transition easy. So whether it's to electrify your home, like BOOMPower is doing, and or providing the access to those tradies and people that are actually going to deliver on that technology change in your home, it's really important to remove that complexity that a lot of this change might impose on you. And I think kind of rethink the whole servicing of consumers.
And that's why I'm so excited to be with the Boom team, because I'm actually in a place where I can actually do something that has a measurable impact on that aspect of the energy transition. And we could you could argue for forever about the delay being caused by government inertia, by policy inertia, by commercial, whatever we want to say. But ultimately, that excuse doesn't exist as much now. There are definitely still hurdles to jump, but right now is the time to go, and I think we're going to see a lot more from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate your time today. Great having a chat with a nice bloke from Brunswick, as always. And I'm sure we'll chat again soon. Thanks, Matty.
Thank you very much, Ewan. We'll see you soon.